Every day I get terrifying news about new virus cases. Cases, not illnesses, not people in the hospital, not people in intensive care, not people on a respirator or a ventilator. Remember those? That was the big panic 6 months ago. Here's a CBC story from April 3rd. Ontario needs 900 new ICU, that's intensive care unit beds, to cope with coming surge in COVID-19 patients, models suggest. So that's new beds, extra beds that were needed immediately. ICU, intensive care unit. It's not just a bed, of course, not just a place to sleep. It's a whole expensive, complex suite. Machines, ventilators, oxygen, complicated sensors, and of course it's all in a hospital. Imagine trying to add 900 ICU beds to cope with the coming surge in a matter of days. Well, no problem. The government of Ontario didn't just add 900 acute care or intensive care beds. On April 16th, it announced this. Province adds more than 2,000 acute care and critical care beds and enacts pandemic staffing plans. Wow. I'll read some more. The province has added 1,035 acute care beds and 1,492 critical care beds and taken steps to ensure hospitals have the staff available to care for a sudden surge in patients. Pretty impressive, but remember, that's just what was added. There were a lot of beds in place before the pandemic. Take a look at these stats. As a result, Ontario has a total of 20,354 acute care beds with the potential for another 4,205 more acute care beds by April 30th. Of Ontario's 3,504 critical care beds, 2,811 are now equipped with ventilators, up from 1,319 when the outbreak first started. More than 20,000 acute care beds? By the way, there are more than 250 different hospitals in Ontario. So just to recap, in early April, the CBC was panicking, saying Ontario needed 900 more beds. Doug Ford met that and raised it, adding more than 2,000 new beds, bringing the total to 20,000, of which 2,811 had ventilators. So how did it work out? Did they survive the surge? Well, look, reality didn't quite listen to the models from the experts and their panics. Look at this. As you can see by this chart of Ontario hospitalizations and ICU cases, the number of ICU beds, intensive care beds, needed in Ontario peaked just 6 days after that panic article in the CBC at a grand total of 264. I can't even find the maximum number who needed ventilators. It's typically a small fraction of the people in the ICU. But just for reference, in the entire province of Ontario today, there are a grand total of 11 people on a ventilator. 11. The province has 2,811 ventilators, just in case. You know, the second surge and all that second wave and all that. Models say, experts say, and all that. Here's the Ontario graph for daily new cases, which is the only one the media is talking about, and for some reason, it's the very first graph on the Ontario statistics page. Then there's the absolutely useless total cases over time graph. You know that by definition, that number can never go down, right? It's like saying total number of Canadians who have ever had a traffic accident over time. You know that number will only grow, right? It cannot shrink, right? Over time, events only add up, they don't subtract. And the number is of no use in any way, is it? It's like saying, did you know that the total number of people who have ever died in the world, it's estimated to be over 100 billion people. And it's only growing. Does that make you feel better or worse? Would a graph of that help you in any way other than to know that the number is only growing? What a weird number to track. Completely useless in every way other than to give you an ominous feeling. It's the daily deaths number that's the key indicator. For weeks in Ontario, it's hovered around 2, plus or minus. It's so tiny on the graph, isn't it? It's so hard to see. That's the whole province of Ontario, 14.5 million people. Here's a chart that makes it easier to see. 0 on some days, 1 or 2 on some days. Average age of the deceased is the mid-80s. I'm sorry to see it, but you know, again, don't mean to scare you. But did you know, according to Statistics Canada, about 100,000 Ontarians die every year from all causes? So you've got 1 or 2 a day from the pandemic, and you've got another 300 a day from all other things. For example, in Toronto, shootings are a bit of a problem. 173 people dead or injured from that this year so far, mostly young people who don't really die from the virus. I wonder why politicians prefer to fight an imaginary battle against a virus that peaked back in April, as opposed to a real problem like gun violence that keeps going up. It's going up. The battle against the defeated virus is done. It's defeated. I've shown you the stats for Ontario, pretty detailed, but it's the same or better pretty much across Canada. For example, the entire province of Saskatchewan, there is 1 person in intensive care. 1 person in a province of over 1 million people. So why is the panic being ratcheted up? Why the emphasis on cases, which can mean anything? It can mean a false positive, for example, as in someone doesn't have the virus, but they take the test and the test accidentally says they have the virus. That's happening a lot.
You know, I think a lot of people think that testing is going to really solve the whole problem, and it isn't. It's one component of a response. If you test somebody today, you only know if they're infected today. And in fact, if you're testing in a population that doesn't have very much COVID, you'll get false positives almost half the time.
That's Ontario's Deputy Public Health Officer saying half of the tests are false positives. They're bragging about how many tests they're giving to people who don't have any symptoms. Why are we spending so much effort testing healthy people with no symptoms? Is it to generate false positives? Is it to instill fear? Is it to make jobs for schemers and scammers, to keep the emergency going for the benefit of someone? Profiteers? I don't know. Why the renewed enforcement? I mean, here in Ontario, Doug Ford, the Premier, he loves going to weddings with his friends. Here he is having a grand old time despite the lockdown. Isn't it odd that he's the one now ratcheting up rules for everyone else except him?
We all know that a second wave of this virus is coming. We see it all over the world. This virus is still amongst us, and it's spreading. So the only question left is, how bad will the second wave be? And the answer to that question is up to all of us. It's up to you, it's up to the 14.5 million people in this province. We've shown what we can achieve when we work together. Together, we got those numbers down. We flattened the curve on the first wave, but we're not out of the woods. And today's numbers, they're a cause for concern for all of us. And let me be crystal clear, every option is on the table. We will take every step necessary, including further shutdowns. In the second wave of COVID-19, it's a scenario that we have been preparing for all summer long.
I don't get Doug Ford. His chief move is to insult people who aren't panicking like he wants them to, even though he himself obviously is not panicking in his real life, his personal life. He's going to weddings. There was some car show, where people have a show and shine, they bring their old cars or whatever. Ford called it a car race or something. I'm not sure if there's actually any evidence that it was racing illegally. And Ford just went nuts on those people. But those are his people, really his kind of people, or they used to be, not now. He's calling them dumb. He's saying they're deplorable.
And then all of a sudden we hear what's happening. They gather, these organizers. And as for the organizers, you know something, guys, I don't get it. I just don't get it. If we weren't so backlogged on MRIs, I'd send you to the MRI to get your brain scanned, because I don't think there's anything in there. We get the protocols out there, and they just blatantly ignore the people.
Oh, and he's calling people concerned about their freedom yahoos.
We have, a bunch of yahoos out in the front of Queen's Park sitting there protesting that the place isn't open, as they're breaking the law and putting everyone in jeopardy, putting themselves in jeopardy, putting the workers in jeopardy, and God forbid one of them end up in the hospital down the street.
It's such an elitist thing when it's said by Hillary Clinton or Kathleen Wynne or the media party sneering at normal people for not wanting to follow unscientific and irrational and arbitrary rules that the ruling class itself doesn't follow. But since when does the head of Ford Nation mock his own people as dumb hicks? That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.